Good evening. My name is Olena and I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. It's very exciting to be here in this room because last time I was here was, or indeed any of us at an event of the Ukrainian Institute, was on the 12th of March 2020, before the first lockdown. And the lecture was by Bogdan Tokarski on Vasil Stus. Thriving in isolation or something like that. Then we're going to find out how to do it. It was a wonderful lecture, and then we've not been back in this space since, so it's really, really good to be here. But the other thing, of course, is that the world changed several times in a very challenging way since that time as well. Today is also World Refugee Day, and I'm sure many of you know already. 12 million Ukrainians have been displaced since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. 5 of them are abroad. So if any of you, and I know some of you are from Ukraine and are displaced, welcome. We really hope that the Institute can become your temporary home away from home. We'll certainly do everything we can to make sure that that's the case for you. And I'm really glad that we'll be talking about history today, because history has been weaponized so much by the Kremlin. I am often asked at different panel discussions to explain the origins of this war, Russia's war against Ukraine, by talking about history. And it always unsettles me, that question, because there's some kind of hope that we can somehow explain what happened because of the difficult historical relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And we cannot. And I always point out that it's good to understand history, it's good to know where this difficult relationship came from, but we need to remember that it's about weaponization of history and not history itself that is at the heart of Russia's war against Ukraine. So, it's my great pleasure to welcome these 2 fantastic historians of a very difficult period of Ukrainian history, and I will let our moderator introduce the speaker, but I'll introduce the moderator. Tonight's event will be moderated by Dr. Olena Palko, who is a Liverhum Early Career Fellow at Birkbeck College, University of London, and a Junior Research Fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw. Starting in August 2022, she will be an assistant professor at the Department of History at the University of Basel, working on her new research project, Soviet Minorities Experiment in Interwar Ukraine, which is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. Her research interests lie in the field of early Soviet cultural history and the interwar history of Eastern Europe. She was awarded her PhD from the University of East Anglia in 2017, and that is where we met when I was teaching at the UEA, and has held research fellowships at Humboldt University in Berlin, at Basel University, and she also holds a degree of Candidate of Sciences, Kandidat Nauk, from the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Olena is a coordinator of a digital project, Shadows of Empire, contesting territorial imaginations and borders in modern Europe, which is conducted at the University of St. Gallen. And Olena is also co-convener of the BASI Study Group for Minority History and host of the podcast series, which I highly recommend, called Eastern Europe Minorities in a Century of Change. And her first book, Making Ukraine Soviet, Literature and Culture, Politics under Lenin and Stalin, which was published in 2020, was awarded the prize for the best book in the field of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature and culture from the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. So we've got an absolutely wonderful moderator here, and I'm sure the discussion will be just as wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for inviting us and for your kind introduction. And let me briefly introduce our main speaker. Dr. Matthew Pauly is an associate professor of history at Michigan State University. He is a core faculty member of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Peace and Justice Studies program, and an affiliate faculty member of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel. He is the author of Breaking the Tongue, Language, Education and Power in Soviet Ukraine, published with University of Toronto Press, which has just been released in a paperback. as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters on early Soviet nationalities policy, education and childhood in the Russian Empire and Soviet Ukraine. He has won grants for his research from the US Fulbright Program, International Research and Exchange Board, American Council for International Education, Shevchenko Scientific Society, and a Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies. Dr. Pauly is currently engaged in the writing of 2 books, a research monograph, City of Children, Juvenile Poverty, Crime and Salvation in Odessa, and a historical survey, Traversing Europe, that prominently integrates Ukraine into the 20th century history of the continent. And I would just like to say that we also met at the UA, the University of East Anglia, because Matt was my examiner of my PhD, so we've been connected through research for a few years now.
Yes, indeed.
Exactly.
I think I was quite kind.
To ask questions, indeed. But as Olena said, we both work on the same period, and it actually, I think, makes us very well positioned to have this discussion today. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and your questions, and sort of my questions and your answers. So to start with, so your research has mostly been focused on Soviet Ukraine during the interwar period. And one of the key developments of this period is the policy of Ukrainisation, or indigenization, and Ukraininisation as its Ukrainian version. Could you perhaps tell a little bit what this policy actually was, what it entailed, just basically provide a little bit of a context for our audience today?
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. We have really another expert on Ukrainianization up here with me who could certainly speak to this question as well. So Ukrainianization is absolutely a critical part of early Soviet power in Ukraine. It's an impossible topic to avoid, and yet many people seem to do so when they confront the history of this region. So, as many of you will appreciate probably in this room, it took the Bolsheviks a lot of doing to capture Ukraine, right? 3 successive Soviet governments of Ukraine. Kyiv changed hands some 16 times. It was a horribly traumatic period in the history of Eastern Europe and history certainly of Ukraine. And so when the Bolsheviks finally succeeded in capturing Ukraine for the 3rd and last time, they began to rethink their policy. They began to think about the challenge that the Ukrainian national movement had met Soviet forces with, and thought that it was time perhaps to reconsider. This was a decision made over the course of successive political debates, and essentially its purpose was as follows. One, most importantly, was to sort of rob the Ukrainian national movement of its fire by tending to at least give some gesture to the notion of Ukrainian national sensibility. The second was to right a historical wrong as they saw it. The fact that the Ukrainian language had been so circumscribed and Ukrainian language schooling had been essentially prohibited for much of the Tsarist period. The Soviets thought that they would be on the right side of history by promoting Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian schooling in specific. So they thought it made them look better. But also, most importantly, it allowed them to propagandize the Bolshevik cause among ethnic Ukrainians, among Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. So promoting linguistic Ukrainianization, promoting the use of Ukrainian, the opening of Ukrainian schools, a network of Ukrainian schools that was supposed to stretch from the primary school to the university, was good politics. It allowed them to explain what Bolshevism was in a language that Ukrainians understood, but also acculturate them to the new political reality of the day, right? To train them in Bolshevism, in particular children, which are the subject of my work. My work is focused on schools, and in specific primary level schools or elementary schools. In the end, it was really about fashioning Soviet citizens in a language that was familiar to the 3/4 of the population that was ethnic Ukrainian and mostly Ukrainian speaking.
Thank you. So you kind of showed one of the aspects of Ukraininisation, which was mainly de-Russification, right? Introducing non-Russian languages and cultures in the public sphere. Arguably, another one was party entrenchment, so basically bringing more local people to the Soviet government and into the Communist Party, making the Soviet power looking more kind of not accessible, but familiar to the people, the locals, basically. And so arguably, indeed, education was one of the key elements and mechanism of bringing the Soviet power closer to the people. But what were the main challenges that Ukrainizers and school teachers faced during this period?
Right. First, if I might just back up a bit, this was a contested policy, right? This is not a policy that was easily settled upon, and certainly there were dissenting voices in the Bolshevik party. So the reality is those voices didn't disappear. They certainly were still present, and they contested this policy all along the way. So that's one absolute constraint that Ukrainizers, those advocating for the expanded use of Ukrainian language and the teaching of Ukrainian culture, broadly considered in the schools, confronted. The other obvious one is there really had been nothing in the way of a robust Ukrainian network of schools up until now. There have been some gestures towards this during the revolutionary years, but things were so politically tumultuous. It was difficult to say real true education and schooling absolutely happened. So they faced an environment where they had to create a education system whole cloth, and then of course the country is devastated, right? Economically devastated by war, and in very real human terms devastated. This is something obviously that has a certain echo with what we're confronting now. But the Soviets actually thought, in a way, that was a good thing, because it allowed them to have a sort of blank slate to create an educational system that they believed would produce citizens enamored with socialism, trained in the possibility of building a socialist state. So they not only pushed Ukrainian language schooling, but they also pushed progressive pedagogy, that is, a form of schooling that was really not by rote memorization of textbooks, but in fact an educational system which was supposed to be designed towards the interest of children, which the children were supposed to reflect back to the teacher. The teacher would articulate and transform what the children's interests were into a curriculum in the schoolhouse. So there's opportunity as well. Where there were shortcomings, there's little in the way of Ukrainian pedagogical literature, right? There simply aren't textbooks. There aren't the sort of curricular materials one needs to actually build Ukrainian schoolhouses in a way where there would be robust education. The Bolsheviks thought that was a good thing. You didn't need textbooks. You could, in fact, rely on teachers to help create these sorts of child-centered lessons, again, in conversation with the children, but also through the efforts of the teachers. So much of the knowledge was derived from arithmetic and scientific lessons that was attuned to the world surrounding the schoolhouse, or surrounding the village, or around the municipal district in which a school found itself in major cities in Ukraine. So there's opportunity. Beyond just material things, teachers are simply not used to teaching in Ukrainian. You don't have a whole cadre of teachers who are equipped to teach in Ukrainian, to say nothing of teaching according to this pedagogical method that I've described to you. So this is all new to them. There are some entrepreneurial teachers drawn from the Ukrainian national movement who threw themselves into this work. People who were absolutely instrumental to the striving for Ukrainian independence, but then adjusted themselves to the Soviet reality, but did so from the perspective of a population that was deeply committed to the idea of a separate Ukrainian national identity and separate Ukrainian language. So these teachers were excited by the possibility as well. And then I guess I'd circle back to my initial comments to talk about this challenge of opposition within the Bolshevik Party. There's obviously surveillance of members of the Ukrainian intellectual community who threw themselves into this work as teachers. So the secret police is never far from what these teachers engaged in, and many of them we know from GPU, or secret police files, that they were under surveillance at an early date. And there's this, I suppose, trepidation and anxiety that is out there. But I would also suggest no one knew exactly what was around the corners. One of the major arguments of my work, that this is a dynamic process whose end is not foreseen. And although non-communist, non-Bolshevik teachers had reason to be anxious, they were more emboldened by the task in front of them, which was this opportunity to really build Ukrainian language schools, Ukrainian language culture, and the Ukrainian language itself, through teaching children to use a form of schooled Ukrainian, right? A form of Ukrainian that is in the midst of standardization during this time. It's of course not true that Ukrainian didn't have some standards before then, but certainly this period of Ukrainianization was a period in which there was greater rigor lent to the idea of a common universal literary Ukrainian that was then taught in the schools.
If I may, I would just perhaps add that I think that the first kind of official spelling reform was conducted in 1928. So this was the end of already the 1920s, when there was a general agreement on what the Ukrainian language should look like, right? How to standardize the spelling and so on, orthography. But perhaps I also, while listening to your answer, I was thinking about my own project, if I may add a little bit here, because I'm working on minorities, and I just wanted to say that the situation was even more complicated if we take into account various ethnic minorities living on the same territory, right? Because it wasn't only the process of building a Ukrainian school, it was also the process of building a Polish, a Jewish, German, and so on and so on. So this is a simultaneous process of kind of constructing identities, but not only of Ukrainians, but also of various ethnic minorities. And this is what, for me, makes this interwar decade so fascinating, where there was a true appreciation of the diversity, and kind of when this derussification did not only go in favor of Ukrainians, but all ethnic minorities within Ukraine. And
absolutely. I mean, in many ways, we tend to fall back on this term Ukrainianization or Ukrainianizacja a bit too readily, right? It really is, as I say in my own scholarship, about de-Russification, is about subverting the language hierarchy and promoting the use of non-Russian languages throughout the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So this would, of course, apply to Polish communities, but most certainly to Jewish communities as well. So promotion of Yiddish as a secular Jewish language. Not everyone wanted to go, as you well know, to these ethnic minorities' schools. Some wanted to go to Russian language schools or even to Ukrainian schools as well. But it was about creating new symbolic power as well through language. So, and all these national minorities, I should add, although certainly their languages, to the extent they wanted to claim them as their languages, some weren't very willing participants in that endeavor. But they also accepted the idea, or at least they were told to accept the idea, that Ukrainian was the state language of the Republic, that the Ukrainian should be a language of interethnic communication. So Ukrainian was taught not just, of course, to ethnic Ukrainian children, but to ethnic minorities within Ukraine as well. So one of the major contentions I make is that that this idea of territorial Ukraine, which certainly already existed among wide swaths of the population of what becomes Soviet Ukraine, it is reified in this period through schooling, and it's not just reified to ethnic Ukrainians, but to the population as a whole. So if we might venture, I know we're going to do so on several occasions, or at least I suspect we will, and maybe in Q&A as well, to the contemporary situation. When you're a scholar such as Olena and myself, you write these books and you talk about these places, and I am quite clearly not of Ukrainian background, and so I had to learn the language and learn these place names, and I created a map for this book, and it's a very distinct idea of what Ukraine is to me by engaging in this research and plopping down cities' names on this map. And then I get pretty into the weeds in this book in terms of talking about really local level politics, local level school politics. And it's my contention that in the 20s and 30s, there would be few who would dispute the idea of a territorial Ukraine. It really becomes much more tangible in this period.
I wanted to ask you about the success of Korenizacja or Ukrainizacja. How would you evaluate the results of the policy, the outcomes, especially when we think of the 1930s and the terror and purges and so on and so on. What do you think were the main achievements of this policy were? And basically kind of the question we can ask whether this policy was successful in de-Russifying Ukraine, as the main objective was, and especially when we think back then and also today of the Russian-speaking urban spaces, right, across Ukraine. So basically, how would you evaluate the results?
So the first thing I'd say is to repeat what I just said, right? That there is one of the major successes of Ukrainianizacja for me is the solidification of the idea of Ukraine. Again, it existed before, and in many ways, this whole policy was responsive to the Ukrainian national movement, right? For the Ukrainian national movement and the Ukrainian sense of self, Ukrainian national identity had to exist for Ukrainizacja or Ukrainization to even happen, and the Bolsheviks have to respond to that reality, right? That's really where this all begins. But I would say a tangible result is this idea. And it doesn't happen because of the Bolsheviks, and it doesn't happen because of Russian Bolsheviks. It happens because largely of the efforts, activities, and sweat and tears of Ukrainizers who were not only ethnic Ukrainians, but many of them of course, were, right? And they weren't, by and large, Bolsheviks. Some of their patrons in the party were relative recent arrivals to Bolshevism. They were Borobisti, they were essentially Ukrainian communists who privileged the notion of national liberation of Ukraine. So those people were absolutely critical and really critical to schooling, but at least in terms of the patronage of this entire effort. But none of it happens without non-party teachers and non-party officials in the Commissariat of Education. So one of the things I set out to do in my research, because we know about this, if you're a scholar engaged in this part of the world, you should know something about Ukraininisation and Ukrainianization. And there's been a lot of classic works on this subject by Mace and Martin and others. But we tend to know about the high echelons of power, and I was really interested in how these things get translated. How it's one thing to issue decrees, it's another thing to see how those decrees are actually implemented and what are the results. So do urban spaces change? They began to. And I certainly have evidence that suggests that even, I have a whole chapter on Odessa, which has motivated this project that I'm currently engaged in on Odessa, where by the end of the 20s, you began to have parents petitioning the state for Ukrainian language schools, believing Ukrainian and knowledge in Ukrainian would offer their children greater prospects in Soviet Ukraine. But, and you have also, just in terms of pure numbers, the fact that that Ukrainian, the proportion of Ukrainian language schools in the Republic actually comes to exceed the proportion of ethnic Ukrainians in the Republic. So this is primary level schools, right? So primary level schools are indeed on paper Ukrainized, but there are problems all along the way, and one of the things that I strongly underscore is just because schools appeared on paper as Ukrainian didn't mean that Ukrainian was being used in the classroom in the way that Ukrainizers would have liked. So they're constantly testing the ability of teachers to speak Ukrainian, and the inspectors from the Commissariat of Education are regularly disappointed by the level of Ukrainian language knowledge of the teachers who've suddenly been asked to teach in Ukrainian. So that's a certainly real constraint, and we can talk more about those sorts of things in terms of shortcomings. But in terms of successes, I do think that had the power situation above all this been different, we might have had a different story. They're
hegemonic at the time?
Right, so I mean, of course, Ukrainization or Ukrainianization more generally throughout the Soviet Union, this process of indigenization doesn't happen without the sanction of Moscow. But again, it doesn't happen in the way that I've described to you in all my preceding comments without the efforts of Ukrainians, both in individual cities in Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kyiv, Kharkiv, and elsewhere. But it also doesn't happen without the support of the Commissariat of Education based in Kharkiv. So the problem with it all is, of course, this was a project about nation building, right? Nation building with the end goal being the development of an internationalist culture, right? There's a paradox already right there, right? So in order for people to become well-versed socialists, the thinking was they first needed to have an understanding of their own national culture before then they moved on to engage in a broader sense of internationalism. So that's problematic to begin with. But another curious thing about all this is we tend to think, and when we look at educational systems, we tend to think that this sort of is a robotic, mechanistic sort of affair, right, as I've already suggested to you. Decrees are issued, schools are built, teachers are put in, trained to teach things, and appropriately oriented children are produced, students are produced. When the actual fact was that this was highly decentralized. So even for orders issued out of the Republican capital of Kyiv, and they are much greater part of this process than any official in Moscow, even they forfeited actual decision making to representatives of the Commissariat of Education at the initially gubernia or provincial level, then regional level, and the like. These are the people closest to the ground who are responsible for designing this strange progressive pedagogy which involved the use of Ukrainian. So there's a worry, right, about what those people are actually doing, because many of them are not party members, and they in turn invested authority in individual teachers, and the teachers, by and large, are not party members as well. So power rests with those who don't have real political power, right? It's a strange sort of inverse of our understanding of power. Power rests with them to make decisions that fundamentally affect the lives of children in Ukraine, and produce a kind of Ukrainian national culture that is building up, but not fully robust in the sense of truly transforming urban environments. So I would say that when we look at the history of the Soviet Union, we actually need to continue to work certainly well beyond Moscow. For anybody who is interested in working on the history of Ukraine, you obviously shouldn't put Ukraine to the periphery of your attention. It should be, in many ways, where you began. But to understand how Soviet power actually operated on a daily sort of level, you need to go well beyond Moscow.
Olena, you already mentioned that history was weaponized and was used as a mobilizing force. And indeed, what we are witnessing now in Ukraine is how history is being misused and abused to justify the invasion and the war that has been going on for 8 years. And in kind of connection to this, I wanted to ask you, this is like a kind of connection from 1920s to today, and I'm sure you all know about those claims by Vladimir Putin when he said basically in one of his addresses that preceded the full-scale invasion when he implied that Ukraine was not a real country but just a historical part of Russia. And he actually, if I may quote, he said that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia. And obviously in what you've mentioned today, you already hinted that obviously this is kind of, it's an abuse of history, it's misinterpretation, and we as historians should try to tackle this misinformation. But I wanted to ask you the first question is, it kind of implies and builds upon what you already said, how your experience and how your research of the 1920s basically challenged this perspective. We all know that it challenges this perspective, but kind of what we shall as historians highlight, what we should speak about now to try to somehow tackle Russian propaganda, which is much more prominent, unfortunately, than Ukrainian voices.
Right. Well, so again, we began with the presumption that none of the Soviet culture that is created in the 1920s, I mean, your book is on becoming Soviet, right? But becoming Soviet is done through the national lens, and it has to be done through the national lens because of the existence of a very strong Ukrainian national movement that forces the Bolsheviks to concede all along the way. Ultimately, brutal power still rests with them. But the way in which Soviet power was exercised was very much responsive to the existing fact of the Ukrainian nation. So I'd say we began with that. We should also, I think, continue. I mean, this may be somewhat. We can have a discussion of this in Q&A if you like. We should acknowledge that Ukrainians were part of this process, right, as well. And they tried to shape a policy that was dictated to them in a manner in which they thought was most beneficial to them. So I think we should also not view everything, to your previous question, view it as a projection from Moscow downwards, but see the way in which Ukrainian actors were critical to setting up these networks of schools. Much of my work centers on opposition because the archival record tends to focus on that, particularly in the urban spaces, right? But Ukrainianization happens because, as I've said, of the committed work of ethnic Ukrainians by and large. Not only one of the main figures in my study is a guy named Jan Ryalpo, who was a deputy commissar of education, who was Latvian, who was a big supporter of Ukrainianization as well. But we should look at these people and realize the centrality of their own work. And of course, as historians, we're tempted to think about what might have been, and then we move on, right? Because we tend not to dwell on the what-ifs in history. But I think it is certainly incumbent upon us to see the ways in which this was a participatory and discursive process, right? In which Ukrainians played an absolutely fundamental role.
I would perhaps just add and advertise the edited volume that we just published. And the volume is called Making Ukraine, Negotiating, Contesting and Drawing Borders in the 20th Century. And actually this is, and it's just been published with McGill Queen's University Press. And this is exactly what Matthew was saying. The idea of Ukraine as a territory, as an identity was already there. And it's already like those different Ukrainian governments that we have during the Civil War period, right? Like between 1917 and 1921, they were trying to define the borders of Ukraine. And when Bolsheviks finally came to power and in 1921, they were just faced with the idea of Ukraine and the borders, which they just basically needed to accept and negotiate. And this is, I mean, I don't want to engage with Putin's claims, but the idea of Ukraine and its territory was already there before the Bolsheviks kind of established their power. And with this, perhaps I'll open the floor for discussion. Is it a good time, Olena?
We tend to lose track of time when two historians get together. Time goes.
So if there are any questions, I already see. I think you were the first one, I think.
Thank you very much. My name is Ewan Grant. I've now essentially broadcast and write on international criminality, and I've been doing quite a bit on the war as a result of that. I worked for European Commission programs in Kyiv for a number of years, and I would like to apologize to every Ukrainian in the audience here. The mission I worked in was not dealing with any way of international cooperation, and we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. Sorry about that. My question is, when did the situation change? Did it change with the supremacy of Stalin to force, or did much of it carry on as you just described in the 1920s?
Mm-hmm.
And quickly, secondly, rather relevant today, of course, what was the situation on the Black Sea coast, specifically the Black Sea coast and indeed the Azov coast?
So regarding the first question, I'm somewhat, I push back against, I suppose, the school revisionist historians who have argued that the Soviet support of the national identity, or national representation never disappears. That's true in fact, but of course, in my view, it's fundamentally altered by the end of the 1920s. So I focus a lot on this show trial that some people in the room will undoubtedly know about, the show trial of the Union for Liberation of Ukraine, SVU, Spilka Vyzvolenia Ukrainy. And I argue that the most prominent Ukrainizers were put on trial, right, including teachers. There is a educational, it's all fabricated by the GPU, by the secret police, but the GPU has enough wherewithal to create a school section for this supposed union as a retort to overly ambitious Ukrainizers, right? And they also create a youth wing associated with this fictional Union for Liberation of Ukraine as a way of also issuing a signal about the potential corruption of children and then adolescents as well. So that happens in, they're arrested in 1929, the show trial happens in 1930. I think it's a hugely important date. In actual fact, Ukrainianization slightly accelerates in the early 30s because the campaign is dovetailed with the Stalinist campaign for industrialization, which involved heavy investment in resources in the East, in the Donbass in particular. So there's an emphasis on trying to Ukrainize the Donbass. But again, it's formal, it's on paper, and my essential argument is that this whole process was problematic all through the period up until then. We have a lot of data that suggests, again, that teachers weren't all that proficient in using Ukrainian, and school children must have been bewildered about what they were being taught in the room, or at least that's what the teachers' press was claiming. So we have no reason to believe the situation got any better. In fact, it could only have gotten worse in my judgment, because there was no real reward for being a good Ukrainizer, particularly after this show trial, where the penalty is quite clear, right? If you're too good at your job, if you're too good at what the state is asking you to do, then you might well be arrested. So there's a huge disincentive. Of course, Ukrainian schools never disappear. There's Ukrainian schools all through the Soviet period, but what really happens after 33, 34, when Ukrainian nationalism is presented as the chief threat to Soviet power in Ukraine, is that there's no effort anymore really to Ukrainize the higher levels of education. So primary schools remain, but they sort of, after initial spike, they tend to recede from the major urban centers, and there's a cutoff in the ladder of education, right? So if you were a parent who had ambitions for your children, unlike the Odessa parents that I just referenced in my comments, you would have now reached a different judgment. If you wanted your kid to do well in life, best not send them to Ukrainian school, or at least think about options beyond the initial first years of primary schooling. Black Sea is Odessa and Mykolaiv are the two cities that feature centrally in my study. And if I just might, I know we have other questions to get to, just quickly. Mykolaiv, I have a really interesting case of these parents that I talked about, pushing back on the notion that their schoolhouse should be transformed into Ukrainian language school. And to me, that's a particularly interesting element of this work, that Ukrainizers were not just about transforming schools to meet the ratio of ethnic Ukrainians in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And they weren't just about taking Ukrainian language culture to the city, but they were about taking it to the center of the city, like where the Tsarist elites would have lived and schools in those areas. And those became particular objects of Ukrainianization.
So I think you're next, then you would be, sorry, and then 2 more questions, yeah.
Thank you very much. In your earlier comments, you were talking about decentralization and implementation and how the decentralization made the implementation really patchy, and how a lot of teachers, although by no means all, were individually motivated to experiment with their own politics and experiment with their own ideas about Ukrainisation. Can you characterise for us with some individual stories, people who went off piste and people who there was amazing political discussion in the early 1920s and how that manifested itself in the way the language was taught and the way people were encouraged to be, and maybe even in this idea about radical teaching methods that you told us about, because I remember images from that period that don't look to me from 100 years distance like radical teaching.
Do not look.
But maybe they felt really radical at the time. So can you tell us a bit more about
Well, the radical element is not to, not to sit down with a book in front of you and memorize it and repeat it back, right? So children were asked to, for example, keep journals, essentially design lesson plans that the teachers then enforce. So that's inverse in the way that, that suggests chaos, and in many ways it turned out to be that way. In terms of how teachers went off course, I don't think they actually thought they were doing this. I don't really have, of course, the archival record is filled to a certain extent, particularly when we get to this period of the early 30s, of suggestions of nationalists in the schools, right, doing horrible things and getting their children to think that Russia's bad and Moscow's bad and we should rebel against Muscovite control. But and some of that may have been true, particularly in the context of the famine, but it's hard to know for sure. What teachers were certainly doing is integrating Ukrainian national culture. So Shevchenko was permitted, of course, in Soviet culture, but they do a hell of a lot of trying to orient lessons around Shevchenko and the readings of the Kobzar and things along those lines, and introduce little bits of folkloric elements of what is Ukrainian national culture, even though that wasn't really officially condoned, because Ukrainian national culture is not supposed to be about the way people dress or what they eat or what they sing, but it's about a Ukrainian representation of urban sensibilities, right? And the city always should have been placed above rural notions of what was a centralized Ukrainian culture. So I actually don't think Ukrainian teachers were doing conspiratorial things. I don't have evidence that they were, but that was the worry, right? That was because there was just so little oversight on what they were doing until there's some moment where they find themselves under suspicion in association with one of these major political trials or the like. So I tend to argue that people proceeded, those who really believed in the idea of Ukrainianization tended to proceed along with the certainty or the faith that they were doing the right thing, right? Until things went awry. They certainly didn't fully understand what the potential penalty would be until the end of the 1920s. So they were doing what the state asked them to do.
Next question, and then would be your question. So.
Thank you. Was there equivalent in countries like Georgia or Belarus or the Baltics to Ukrainization? I'm just wondering if there's something specific about Ukraine that also then stoked something kind of enduring, if you will, that's part of the reason why Ukraine has such a big hold on the Russian psyche today.
Yeah, well, the reason Ukraine has a big hold on the Russian psyche is this, as revealed by Putin's comment, the failure to accept Ukraine as a reality, right? It's just a fiction, or it is Russia, right?
Why is Ukraine, though? That's what I'm so interested in.
Right. I mean, specific response to your question as regards to history, of course, yes. Koordinacija, so the koordinacija is the word we use to apply to the policy throughout the Soviet space, and it certainly happened in Belarus and other places. Olena could speak on this as well, because she's been the editor of this edited volume in which the people spoke about the multiple vantage points impacting Ukraine, but from areas outside Ukraine as well. Belarus was a big place, certainly. Central Asia. There's a huge aspect of indigenization as well, but Ukraine arguably pushes it the furthest because they had strong-minded commissars of education and nationally oriented Communist Party members who patronized, who supported the endeavor. And Terry Martin's classic argument in this book called The Affirmative Action Empire is they get themselves in trouble when they began to promote Ukrainianization beyond the borders of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, because of course Ukrainians live beyond Ukraine. And so when they would send teachers, for example, my subject of research, to the Kuban and elsewhere, to Siberia. And that's another decentralized aspect I should have perhaps talked about more. But individual, regional, and provincial educational authorities are the ones sending these teachers. They're not orders coming from Moscow, and they're really not orders coming from Kyiv. Kyiv is sort of facilitating it all. But the actual transfer of teachers is taking place between one provincial education section and another one, and in this case, a provincial education section in Ukraine and one in Krasnodar.
So they subverted its purpose, though, in effect.
They subverted
its purpose, in effect, by taking it. So
yes, but they didn't. I mean, why not? This is the letter of the law. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't hear Putin describe Belarus and Georgia and the Baltics as fictional countries. That's the part that I'm puzzled about.
Well, I don't think you should be too puzzled. Honestly, I mean, Belarus linguistic culture does not develop in the robust way that it does in Ukraine. I mean, to Olena's question about success, I don't think many people, honestly and candidly, believe this. I don't think that many people question the notion of a place called Ukraine.
So it's the success that really created the problem.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
If I may, I'll just add an example, because I'm co-editing a special issue also on the 1920s, and we look at different examples from different peripheries. And there is one article on Kyrgyzstan, and basically they also had an incredible source. It's a travelogue of the Ukrainian alpinists who went to write about Tian Shan. But they also write about what they saw on the way to Tian Shan. And there is a very interesting episode when they come to those villages of Ukrainian settlers, and those Ukrainian settlers in Kyrgyzstan, they ask these people, could you please talk to the authorities in Kharkiv and tell them that we don't have a Ukrainian school? We are supposed to have one because this is, in line with Ukrainization, but we don't have it. So please talk to them there. And it's very interesting how, basically what you just said, that people even there, it wasn't just people in Kharkiv who were trying, sort of to send it, their teachers and sort of not impose, but implement Ukrainization outside of Ukraine. But there were also people, Ukrainians who knew about their right for Ukrainian school, and they were demanding it. And this is very interesting dynamic as well. And I think is also, when you look not only, when you go even beyond Ukraine, it's become even the Ukrainian history becomes even more interesting. So this is just as an example. Sorry, I'm kind of abusing my role.
No, you should abuse your role.
Moderator.
Absolutely.
Next question, and then yours. Sorry, and then here. Yeah.
My name is Jonathan Silverman. I'm not an academic, but I wonder if you could comment on a slightly different view of what took place. I think October 1917 opened nation time, not just for Ukrainians, but for all the oppressed nationalities in the former Tsarist Empire. There was a flowering, for example, of literature and culture for Jews. Gemilev talks about what the Tatars gained, and so on and so forth. And that corresponded to the policy advanced by Lenin and Trotsky, which was not for a Russification, but for the opposite, for a voluntary union of Soviet socialist republics, that nations were equal, declared equal, and not just equal, but that there was a policy of affirmative action imposed or followed for those nationalities that were most oppressed in the Soviet Empire. Actually, I think Putin's argument that Lenin created Ukraine is in a way a backhand, and it's wrong, but it's a backhanded compliment to the pursuance of that policy. It was written into the banner of the Second Communist International: workers of the world and oppressed nations, oppressed peoples unite. And without that, without that policy, there would have been no Russian Revolution. Russians constituted a minority in the Tsarist Empire. Without the policy that was adopted by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, actually even pre-Bolsheviks, the RSDLP at its founding Congress in 1898, I believe, the R, I read a report by Lenin of the Third Congress of the Bolshevik Party, which actually was published in Yiddish, as a matter of fact, where he explains that the R for the RSDLP was, I don't have the language, was Rossiskaya, not Ruskaya. That is, he wasn't trying to impose the Russian nationality on, but talking about, the territory of the Russian Empire.
Excuse me, we don't have much time. If you have a question, perhaps,
Yes,
because we have more questions from...
Okay, let me just finish.
Yeah.
Lenin defended this against who he called was a great Russian bully, Stalin. And he defended it in Ukraine, he defended it in Georgia, he defended it too. For the last 18 months of Lenin's life, that was a major struggle that he engaged in. And Stalin's counter-revolutionary policy reversed the gains on many questions, but including on the national question. And it was the defenders of Lenin, for example, Trotsky in 1939, who again came back and defended independence of Ukraine. This wasn't some realpolitik. It was a deeply held view about what humanity needs to do in order to defend the interests of oppressed nationalities and win them to a socialist future, something that Stalin overturned, destroyed with the deaths of millions in Ukraine itself.
So your question is complicated, actually, and would take a hell of a long time to answer. I would say no doubt the call to national liberation appealed to elements outside the sort of ethnic central part of the Russian Empire, but an appeal to elements that eventually joined this effort that I talked about in my comments today. They become part of the Bolshevik Party in Ukraine, and some were already part of that party and try to sway things more towards what you're emphasizing. And Lenin is to be credited for pushing back against chauvinism of Russians, right? This idea that Russians should, by their very nature, have the right to rule over other people. But that ignores the reality of the Civil War, the multiple attempts by Soviet forces centered in Russia. They weren't exclusively ethnic Russians, but the forces absolutely were centered in Russia and caused absolute havoc, tragedy, and misery in Ukraine. And then, of course, one needs only to reference the comments that I've already made, that the power rests with the secret police that is absolutely linked to political power in the center. So even if the shadings of the policy that I've described are fundamentally a part of a decentralized effort, nothing happens without brutal force handling the reality of what was occurring in Ukraine. So, affirmative action is Terry Martin's, the name of Terry Martin's book. So I invite you to read it since you invoked the particular term. Stalin, in fact, was a supporter of much of this. Stalin, yes, read his scholarship. We'll leave it there. I'll trust my expertise on this particular question.
Your question is next.
Just on that last point, which I've also got my own shorter question, but on that last point, I'd also strongly recommend people to look at Brendan McGeever's book on anti-Semitism in the Russian Revolution, because he takes this policy, which on paper and at the top is absolutely an anti-racist, anti-Semitic policy, and he just asks the question, and it's mainly about the Civil War period, what actually happens on the ground. And it's a difficult and horrible, in some ways absolutely brilliant story, but otherwise difficult and horrible. My question is about the countryside and about literacy, because my own historical research is on Russia, and the period in Moscow Oblast, obviously there was still massive illiteracy in the countryside, and the teachers were going and trying to do something about it. And I suppose part of that is about resources. So you mentioned when you said about the Bolsheviks said it's not so bad not having books. I thought a bit like the question at the back. I mean, that doesn't sound like Lunacharsky or Nadezhda Krupskaya who were in charge. That sounds like somebody trying to make the best of an absolutely impossible situation. And I just wonder if you can.
I wouldn't disagree. They're trying to make the best of a difficult situation, and they are absolutely trying to encourage literacy. A bunch of Olena's work is on this. It's just they only had so many books that made it to the village level. So that's one of the other sort of contradictions of the policy that I described. The Ukrainian-speaking population is largely outside the city. Right? So that's where the effort should be directed, when in fact the best Ukrainian language literature that is available is in the city. And teachers want to be good teachers, educated teachers. Teachers with wherewithal want to be employed in urban schools. So that's often where they made use of their talents, and they made use of a sort of literate base within the city, and people, of course, who are literate in Russian, parents who were literate in Russian who had children who attended Ukrainian schools found themselves in a position then of supporting the idea of a separate and different kind of literacy, but literacy all the same. So, and you have figures in your book on literacy, something approaching. You remember precisely?
Well, I just wanted to say that I think it wasn't that of a contradiction, because the aim of it was to de-Russify, right? Rather than, obviously it came sort of hand in hand with learning literacy, obviously, but literacy, as Lenin said, is not only about reading books, it's about political literacy.
That's right.
But if you want to de-Russify, then you kind of target the urban population, right? And then thinking that those in villages, they will somehow learn, so
right, and the city
will sort of come at some point.
It will come, and children, a lot of what I document is children heading on field trips to the village from the city, right? Bringing knowledge with them, bringing, in some cases, newspapers and periodicals, and they found themselves in their early 30s. Proponents of literacy drive, as well as drives towards collectivization and the like. So that was all part of it. Just because it's bothering me that I didn't mention it, and I want to slip it into my comments here. Also, in regards to literacy, there's political literacy and there's labor literacy, right? They need to understand what socialism is about. And the radical aspect of schooling was in Ukraine had a separate educational system from Russia, right? Ukraine had labor schools, 7-year labor schools that led to a 2-year secondary school that was oriented around a particular vocation. It wasn't truly trade training, but it was training in a particular general craft rather than preparation for employment in a specific industry. And that was unique about Ukraine because Ukraine was so much more destroyed, to my previous comment, during the war, right? Totally devastated by what we should see as a projection of power from Moscow. So that was a part of it all, as well as this notion that Ukrainianization was considered incomplete if Ukrainian children didn't attend the full 7 years of primary school. And Ukrainizers were constantly upset with the notion that they would stop at 4 years because it was a 7-year primary school, but it was divided into 2 clusters, 4 years initially and then 3 years, and too many stopped at 4. So that was another form of schooled literacy. You had to reach the end of what was being taught to you.
I just perhaps add a little bit that also this is, Matt, your previous comments, the link between education and industrialization, right? They need to bring more workforce to the cities, right? And the workforce was coming from the villages. So the idea was that they need to create a comfortable language environment in the cities, that these peasants would not feel themselves alienated, right? That they would be easier to sort of assimilate, make them, like as laborer, right? And this is also perhaps links to your question about why Ukraine is so important, as this understanding that Ukraine is, it has huge natural resources, right? And it was the center, the industrial center, early in the Russian Empire, and obviously in the
Skills as well.
Yeah. And this is what Matt said, that it was devastated, but at the same time, it has this huge potential. And when we read Lenin and Stalin during the revolution, during the civil war, they say the Russian Revolution is doomed without Ukrainian steppe and Donbas coal. This was clear to them. So obviously, this was this idea that, and we can say that it's the same now, right? That this link of Ukraine as a potential, basically economic potential that they lack. But it's
and then this, right. And then the rationale disappears, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because with the Holodomor, right, this opposition of the peasants, they basically not being able to re-educate the peasants, they kill the peasants, so to say. I mean, it doesn't sound good, but
Part of the fact that Russia's so bereft itself, so Ukraine becomes that much more important.
we have this question, and Olena, so.
Thank you. My question is regarding the Ukrainian and Ukrainization. So when I was learning Ukrainian, one of the key books I used to always have writing anything was 1929, Grigori Holskevich, his autography, The Dictionary, 40,000 words, and in the diaspora we were brought up with this book, and this was the etalon, the benchmark, the gold standard of Ukrainian language. I think over the years since it's lost, it hasn't been as widespread across Ukraine. But in terms of the language, what was the book came out in 29 in Kharkiv, 40,000 words. What was influencing then the development of the Ukrainian language in that decade?
You want to handle this question? Yeah, Olena is the expert on literature, so.
Actually, I mean, as it happens, together with my colleague Roman Horbek, we published an article on the language policy, basically kind of how the standardized, the unified Ukrainian language came about. And indeed, this is a watershed. It's 1929. This is what the first Congress, of, we can say, Ukrainizers, those people who were advocating in favor of standardized Ukrainian language when they all met. And actually, in 1928-29, they chose, this was also what is interesting, that they had a lot of delegates from Western Ukraine, so from kind of Poland's Ukraine, right? Therefore, from Eastern, so from Halychina, basically. So they came together trying to understand how to standardize the language. And this was the first time when kind of the Ukrainian language across the border became unified and standardized. But later on, we see this new pravopis, the new spelling reform in the mid-1930s, when basically the Russians, sort of the Moscow perspective, intervened, and they rewrote the dictionary with words becoming more and more, the kind of the Ukrainian translation of a Russian word. And it's actually interesting. I remember talking to my Ukrainian supervisor when he said that this is how it all came about. There was in 1928, there was a Ukrainian word which they saw a Polonism, influenced by Poland. Then the next dictionary was that there was one word closer to Ukrainian, and then another one which would resemble Russian. But in 10 years' time, the first one would come the Russian resembling words, and then the second one would come Ukrainian. So, and the last step was, this is the translation to show that I can't think of an example, but it would be just Russian word in Ukrainian and kind of in Ukrainian spelling, saying that this is a Ukrainian word. Of course, by the 1970s, we would think that Ukrainian language is so close to Russian just because it has been manipulated through the decades. But if you look at this programming, the spelling reform, the dictionary from the 1920s, you'll see that the words that were used were very different to those that we would think about in the 1980s and so on. But you can actually trace the process, how the Russian version of the word, or Russian sounding version of the word, would replace the Ukrainian sounding, Ukrainian, I don't know how to explain it, but the more sort of traditional Ukrainian word. And this is amazing how much continuity was there. Actually, it's indeed an intentional policy, right? It didn't come overnight. That now we would say that Ukrainian language isn't the same language, right? No, it isn't. But there's a lot of similarities thanks to the central policy.
Yeah. You find it out through the reading of the sources as well, right? When you're reading the archival sources, you see the language shift. You certainly see expressions of mixed Russian and Ukrainian, but also of a sort of literary standard evolving, and teachers were tested on this, right? One of the amazing things I found in Odessa were these actual records of teachers' essays. So the handwritten responses teachers gave on tests regarding the Ukrainian language knowledge. And they'd make various grammatical, the inspectors, testers, examiners would make various remarks, but they were also very interested in the content of the questions because they were often asked, what was Ukrainianization? What is its political meaning? And they were interested in those responses as well as the evolution of the language towards the standard, which was in 1928 and then beyond.
Oh, I think you have the question. And
I have so many questions, but I'll limit myself to one, and I'm totally struggling to choose which one. But it's something that you already touched upon, Olena, and this is a question to both of you, of course. We've been focusing on Soviet Ukraine in this conversation. Ukrainianization is seen as an exciting success story in Western regions, in interwar Poland. And I just wanted to see if you could comment a bit more on that kind of collaboration, how many people, or what kind of people would go over to Soviet Ukraine, because obviously in interwar Poland the policy was increasingly restrictive in terms of the use of language and so on. So just that kind of cooperation between the two, and perhaps maybe disillusionment as well, and maybe disillusionment on both sides. Were I said one question, but I can't help myself. Were there signs among the Ukrainianizers? Could they foresee that the repression was coming? I mean, they were part of. They could see how repressive the state was and how repressive the policies were. Could they foresee that this is going to backfire and be used against them too?
I don't think they did until the SVU trial. That's what the documentary record suggests to me. Although they, occasionally said not very kind things about Soviet power, they weren't organizationally anti-Soviet in any respect. So at least, there's all sort of categories of individuals here. There's the teachers, there's the true sort of Ukrainian national intellectuals that led this process, and then there's the ordinary teachers, and then there's officials in the Commissariat of Education. What I keep on insisting to people who are doubtful is read my work, first of all. But there's a huge amount of effort spent on this policy. It wasn't some sort of sham, artificial retreat. It was a real expression for trying to achieve socialism in Ukraine. As regards Western Ukrainians, I mean, you know, Terry Martin, of course, makes this quite famous argument about the Piedmont principle of the propaganda power of Soviet Ukraine for leftist Galicians. I don't know to what degree that is true on an aggregate. I certainly talk about individual Galicians. Olena's referenced orthographers who were absolutely critical to the creating of this 1928 orthographic standard. I do have petitions that I cite in my work of Galician revolutionaries asking, or Galician communists asking for their children to be housed in Soviet Ukraine so they can attend Soviet Ukrainian schools. And then, of course, there were Galicians who were left over from the Civil War who had fought on the Soviet side ultimately. And they're turned to as teachers because there was no question. There may have been a question about the kind of language they were speaking, but there was no question that they were versed in some Ukrainian and could be given some responsibility in the school, and they had their appropriate political credentials, but many of them found themselves in trouble later on.
I would perhaps add a few examples, because we know of a lot of those Galicians, also those who emigrated, right, with the fall of the Ukrainian People's Republic, and who they basically, who came back. This was Mikhailo Hrushevsky, right, who came back in 1924, but also Stepan Rudnitsky, the famous cartographer, who also came and then perished in the Soviet Union. So there were a lot of examples of those really like kind of this Ukrainian non-communist elites which truly believed that this was an opportunity, that the 1920s provided an opportunity for creating Ukraine, although a socialist Ukraine. Obviously they didn't share the Bolshevik values and so on, but they did come back. But also from my book, from my research, I remember, and this, I might be wrong, but I think it was 1928 or 1929, so very close to obviously the preparation for the trial were already there, but Mykola Skripnik, who was the commissar for education after 1926, he was in Lviv, and he basically spoke to the Ukrainians there, saying, we have a huge shortage of personnel, of teachers, of Ukrainian-speaking staff. Come over to Ukraine. You'll have a job, and as you already mentioned, right? The situation in Poland was very dire for Ukrainians. So if I remember correctly, I think 500 teachers came to Soviet Ukraine, and this was already the second half of the 1920s. So they really saw the Ukrainization as a huge opportunity, right, for Ukraine, but also for themselves, right, because they could find work, they could use their skills, which they couldn't, unfortunately, in Poland. So it's really an interesting dynamic. And in this regard, just like a remark to your question, that why Ukraine was so important, because Ukraine, same as Belarus, it was this border zone. It was just a border with, kind of the capitalist world. So they needed to put more effort here to show how good the Soviet, power is, so that those people, in the West might either emigrate and support, obviously, the cause, because this is a propaganda tool, right, to show how many people actually come into, they are leaving this capitalist Poland and same as Romania and Czechoslovakia and so on, and they are turning to the Soviet Ukraine. But at the same time, it was an attempt to sort of weaken those governments in case of a future war. So there are a lot of consideration. Why Belarus was not as successful as Ukraine? It's just that Ukraine, as Matt said, the national movement was much stronger than in Belarus, right? In the early 1920s. But so we have the same policies, but a different level of implementation if we compare Belarus and Ukraine. And that's why it's so interesting also to compare these two republics.
We've focused a lot on schooling and education because that's what I work on, but obviously Ukrainianization was also about transformation of the language of the state and the style of governance, and teachers were critical to that as well, right? So Ukrainianization happened in the government. Government employees had to take tests also demonstrating the Ukrainian language proficiency, and the people that corrected those tests and administered those tests were often leading Ukrainian language teachers. So it was profitable. You could not make a lot of money, but you could make more money to live in what was admittedly, we shouldn't overinflate the success, right? What was clearly a shortage economy. You could make some additional supplementary money by being both a teacher and an official state Ukrainizer. I would just, I guess, end with a final comment that we should not lose sight of these human beings, right? Actual human beings with knowledge and abilities implemented and realized this policy and then suffered tremendously for what they were being asked to do.
Are there any other questions from, oh, yeah.
I wanted to link a little bit the past with the present. There was a very interesting phrase that becoming Soviet through Ukrainization, and what we are facing now, because at present with such strong identity being in Ukraine again on rise, there is this again external forces working, and now Ukrainization is possible all alone, just based on the initiative within the country, or it's becoming European via Ukrainization. How is it, what is the dynamic now, in your opinion?
I mean, I always defer to the judgment of Ukrainians to decide on what's going to happen in their own country. Lesia and I talked a bit before coming in about the lessons from this period that might be applied to the contemporary situation. And I would say one fundamental one is, even with my response to this earlier question about fighting against chauvinism of Russians, even the Bolsheviks, we may look at it with a jaundiced eye, but tended to accept Russian at a certain level for what it was, right? It was a language of former imperial control. And so I think, Ukrainianization is going to happen now as a result of voluntary choice of people choosing, making their own willful choice to use Ukrainian more, or as has been reported, learn Ukrainian as they find themselves in refugee situations in Western Ukraine. But I also think that perhaps the rest of the world has woken up to the idea of the fact that, yes, there shouldn't be constraints on the rights of Russian speakers, but that Russian still is an expression of empire, right? And it's not just any national minority language. It's a national minority language with a particular political baggage to it. So perhaps that will attenuate conversations about the way in which Ukrainian culture develops in whatever we see Ukraine becoming, and what the rights of national minorities are in relation to the state language, which is only one, Ukrainian.
I just saw a piece of news about Mykolaiv that I think they banned the use of Russian language at schools altogether. So this was an administrative decree as well, but this is obviously in response. And Mykolaiv, this is what we spoke, right? That this is the coast, this is the south, this is kind of Russian-speaking area, right? So the idea is that people can use whatever they want at home, but schooling and perhaps kind of state institutions should be in Ukrainian, and people should accept this. Really,
and I guess I would amplify, since I'm not of Ukrainian descent and I again learned the language, that I think it matters what the external world thinks, because the external world is always commenting on Ukrainian language laws, education laws, and the like. And I can't help but feeling that sometimes there's an acceptance of the notion that somehow Ukrainian is artificial, right? That it's not a real language by international arbiters of language policy and linguistic rights and human rights. And I think that dynamic has changed, I hope. I know it's a struggle, and I had a senior student write a thesis with me at my university and wrote essentially Russian and Ukrainian are the same language, and this was my own student, so one has to constantly push back against this notion. But I do think that I hope some proportion of the world has woken up to the fact that Ukrainian is its own language, and it doesn't need to prove it. It is, because Ukrainians choose it to be. So
I just think we'll just take one last question. And you were the first, I'm sorry.
My question is actually an attempt to get you just to broaden out a little bit more on the Ukrainianization aspect. And it actually comes from the context that for many years I've been involved with education and culture in Ukraine, and have very close links with Tarasova Hora, that amazing location of Taras Shevchenko's burial place, and that temple to Ukrainian culture that was built in the 30s. There's something with close proximity. For one reason, I've never actually gone into the origins. And your reference to the Ukrainian driving, I mean, it was in the 20s and 30s, it was about a lot more than just educational. Is it film, theatre,
sure.
music, what the public, what the people were absorbing. And that temple that was built there, decided on, I'm not sure when, late 20s, early 30s, and then it was opened about 1930, 35, 36. Could you just close with, maybe make some comment on the broader context, these other aspects, and in particular, how was that being driven? You've commented on these important education commissars, but a project like that had to come from Moscow, so there must have been a very close relationship.
No, I don't think it comes from Moscow. It comes from Kharkiv. Again, I think it is. I would insist upon its decentralized nature. I would insist at the very, I mean, it is sanctioned by Moscow. There's no question, but there's not specific instructions coming from Moscow on how to manage all this. Republican political authorities, Moscow tells you when things go awry, right, and when things go amiss, most certainly. But the policy is crafted very much on the Republican level. And again, it is left to local employees of state to carry out. And the Commissariat of Education was, I mean, I'm sorry, absolutely the fulcrum around which the whole policy happened. So that applies to multiple aspects of education, not just primary level schooling, but certainly film and theater, and we have colleagues who work on these issues as well. But the Commissariat of Education and the Commissar of Education was hugely important to the crafting of the broad policy of Ukrainianization. And so went Commissars of Education, right? The two most famous being Skripnik, who Olena already mentioned, who commits suicide, recognized, and Shumsky, who's reprimanded and dismissed. Yeah.
I would just say that it was called Commissariat for Education, but it was in control of culture, publishing, so everything kind of, all the humanities, whatever. So everything what you can think where the Ukrainian language could be implemented, everything was coming through this commissariat.
Sometimes it's translated as enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
Teachers are less sexy to talk about. Apologies to the teachers in the crowd, but they are the actors that make this happen, as I suggested. For the trade unions, for the party, for the government to demonstrate that it was complying with decrees on Ukrainianization, again, they would have been tested by educators. at some rank. So.
Well, we can continue this conversation because we are going to have a short reception next door in the wonderful library. If you haven't been to this building, please explore it. And we invite you all for a glass of wine so we could keep talking to Olena and Matt.